My name's Rose Hiscock. I am the Director of Museums and Collections of the University of Melbourne, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on today, the people of the Kulin Nation. Why I leapt ahead is because when we acknowledge our First Peoples, we acknowledge them always as our first artists and our first scientists. And because here in this conversation today we're talking about creativity and the arts, I'd ask you to reflect on the role that our First Nations peoples have played in shaping who we are culturally as a nation. So we have a stellar panel with us today. No pressure, people. And we could have filled this room 4 times. I'll introduce them quickly now, and then we'll leap into a conversation. So we have Professor Duncan Maskell, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne, Kate Torney, the CEO of the State Library of Victoria, and Adrian Collette, the CEO of the Australia Council for the Arts. We hold these forums monthly, and they're a precursor to the opening of Melbourne Connect. And when we started this conversation at the start of the year, Melbourne Connect was a hole in the ground. And I'd like to acknowledge our colleagues at Lendlease here today, because now we're about 6 or 8 floors into the sky, and we can really see that building starting to take shape. And it will be an incredibly dynamic new facility for Melbourne. And the role of Melbourne Connect is to foster interdisciplinary practice, interdisciplinary conversations, embedding research into business and industry, to foster entrepreneurship, and to encourage the public to engage with all those aspects. And that's through, particularly through Science Gallery Melbourne. So we decided not to wait until Melbourne Connect opened at the end of the year to get going with a conversation about innovation and entrepreneurship. And we've held these events each month in the lead up to the opening. So we've covered driverless vehicles, the health sector, artificial intelligence, food security, health and wellbeing. And we thought about, well, what would be the right subject to close our year with? And we thought the thread that runs through all innovation and and entrepreneurship is, of course, creativity. And so we thought we'd build the most experienced, star-studded panel we possibly could to have a conversation about creativity. And we didn't want it that these conversations are about interdisciplinary thinking and throwing hand grenades in from other sectors and starting to cross-fertilise and create connections. And so the combination of a Vice-Chancellor of a university, the head of the library, and the head of arts for our nation seemed to be a very good starting point for such a conversation. So I'm going to start with a personal reflection. And Duncan, I want to throw to you. It's a very, very simple question. What role does creative practice play in your daily life?
Well, I'm not going to say that I make it all up as I go along, but sometimes that would be really true. I think that everything that's valuable in the world requires creativity for me, at least. In a university setting, everybody in the place is being creative. Even things that people might consider mundane, like teaching students in their first year, you've got to be creative about how you think about that and how you do that. But I think in a bigger picture, I'm put my cards on the table. I did a lot of music in my youth. I really love art, and I'm a scientist. A lot of people think, oh, that's unusual, but it isn't. It really isn't. Most of the good scientists I know have also got creativity. They've got artistic elements in their lives. And actually, I think that being a research scientist is one of the most creative jobs you can have. You've got to dream up new ideas. You've got to think about ways of testing those ideas. The only difference, I don't believe this two nations stuff at all. I think it's one of the worst things that ever happened to the world. It's the essays about two nations. It really made a divide where there needn't be one. I think we can all learn from each other in terms of the creative process that people have to go through to do all sorts of interesting things. The only difference between the arts and the sciences actually is that artists dream up new things and then work up with their practice, how that might develop and look and all those kinds of things. Whereas scientists then have to destroy that beautiful object with their hypothesis testing and experiments. Speaking as a scientist, that can get very depressing, I can say. But so I rely on. I've got beautiful pictures in my office, for example. You've been there. Just having that atmosphere around me helps me to feel better and think clearer. I listen to music a lot. The creative arts play an important central part in my life anyway. And as I say, everything I think that certainly in the university setting that we do that is of real value has to rely on great creativity. When you put artists and scientists together, if they go in with an open mind, they always learn something from each other.
Duncan, do you have a music genre that particularly resonates? Is it Dorothy Dixon?
Very naughty question. I was a teenager in London in the 1970s. I never had.
Surprised you're here.
I never had green hair in the Mohican, but a lot of my mates did. Actually, ska is my favourite genre of music.
Do you play an instrument?
Oh, really? I was a classically trained clarinet player. I played a lot of classical music on my clarinet, and I also played jazz on my clarinet and sax. I played sax as well, and I did a lot of rock music on my saxophone as well. So the final thing I ever did to be paid for music was in a rock band. So I had a leather jacket. I was a lot thinner in those days, and I had hair down on my shoulders.
Note to University of Melbourne, Google. Luckily, Facebook wasn't around when we were teenagers. I don't think any of us would have jobs, hey? So Kate, can I ask you the same question? So your own personal habits within the arts.
Yeah. Well, look, prior to joining the library, I was a journalist for 25 years, and I remember the second day that I came to the library, and I arrived early, and I was in that domed reading room by myself, and I thought, oh my God, I've been in frenetic newsrooms for 22 years. Why didn't I find this place earlier? But on a daily basis, I think creativity is all around me. When I think of just waking up in the morning and the music my teenage daughter is listening to, the images that are around me, incredibly important. I think that shift in my career change has also made me ponder about conscious choices to identify the creativity and the artistic motivations that are around you as well. And I think for me too, looking at the library, if you walk through the State Library at any time of the day, I challenge you to find a more diverse group of people. And one day, about a year ago, I was taking a visiting journalist from the States through the library. She was writing a piece for the New York Times on the role of 21st century libraries. And I met her on the steps of the library at about midday on a Sunday. And she said, I just cannot believe this. This is like a train station. And she said, and they're all young. They're all under 30. And when I took her into the dome, we were wandering around, and she said, they're sitting on 160-year-old chairs, and it's beautiful, but it's, what draws them here? And it was like I'd kind of set it up. We were wandering around, and my 18-year-old niece was there studying for VCE. And so we stopped, and I said, here is a live one, you can ask her. And she said, so, what is it? You could be at home in your bedroom. And she just looked up and she said, but why would you be when you can be here? And the elements of creativity that draw people to that space are multiple layers, and that's a beautiful thing. So I'm surrounded every day by creativity that you can almost touch and feel, which is an incredible privilege.
Fabulous. You also happen to just tell me that you've just read 20 books, and I'm sorry to ask you this question because I'm sure you get it in every single conversation you have. But what's this? What was the last book, or give us a standout of something you've read recently?
So I'm currently reading Brunei, which is, I don't know whether any of you are reading it at the moment, but a fantastic sort of bit of a thriller around Bruny Island, and so really great. And Charlotte Wood's latest book as well, I've really enjoyed. So I've had a little bit of a sabbatical over the last couple of months, and so 20 books is sort of not the norm. I don't want to, create an impression that that's what I'm doing all the time, but it's been a lovely little period of time, and I've just gone through the stellar short list, and I've loved that. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Kate. Adrian, do you still sing?
No.
And what role does the creativity play
no one
with
can
that?
afford me. I fool around at home with a guitar still and sing a bit, and but no, not really.
So now, Adrian, seeing, I know that you always participate in the arts, and that's a through line through your life. But now that you have to do it for a job, has anything changed for you?
Well, a bit's changed because I have to work so much in the political and policy sphere. And at the Australia Council, you actually walk a very fine line. You get nothing done without the support of the sector and artists, and you get nothing done without the support of government. So that will seem familiar to a lot of people in this room, I'm sure. But finding a productive match between those very different sets of expectations sometimes is how you spend a lot of your time. So your advocacy tends to work that way. But most of the things I've ever done in my professional life were born out of my interest in music and books. And I was fortunate, I think, to go to university at that time for a moment where it was all free, where very few of us actually went, and that's why it was all free. But you went entirely to follow your passions, and that's what I just kept doing. On the creativity thing, I think we have to be a little bit careful. At the Australia Council, as you know, Rose, we've really embraced it. One of the fundamental shifts we're making is from arts to creativity, because I think you have to see public investment in the arts as public investment in something much, much larger. And other countries, especially the UK and Canada, are way ahead of us on this stuff. I remember saying to Duncan last time we talked that the 6 years I spent back at the University of Melbourne, as I like to think of it, I spent a lot more time talking to scientists and engineers than artists. Yeah. But what I found was, and this is the whole point about creativity and Duncan's point about how multidisciplinary it is, but what drives them is often the same. We might want to talk about commercialization and the wonders of discovering Wi-Fi and Cochlear and whatever, but like the very great artists I've worked with, a lot of the gun researchers just have some problem. They have to find an answer to some problem or a challenge they have to respond to. And as something of a suit, I spend a lot of time trying to be reasonable about the value of the art, of artists and culture, knowing very well that the motivation is often something else. But that's the dialogue you have to keep having, especially with government, if that makes sense. But I think Duncan's point about, scientists are fundamentally skeptical, so they get up in the morning saying, what's wrong with what I did? Where artists get up saying, isn't it wonderful? And why isn't the world taking notice? Although a few painters have burnt their paintings, and Joel Mandy Hopkins burnt a few poems, so there's a level of skepticism there.
Can I just throw to the room for a moment? I just want to get a show of who's in the room. So just across industries. So firstly, government. Anyone working in government? Okay. On the entrepreneurship, innovation sector, community? Yep, handful. University? Okay, yeah. Any practicing artists in the room? Yep, a sprinkling. Okay, so, and just general business, commerce, business, who's in business? Yeah. Okay, and now for a show of hands from you of who would you, for whom in this audience is the arts central to your life, or creativity central to your life? Both. Living. Yeah, okay, just about everyone.
Job done, let's go.
Okay, yeah. So I want to throw noting two of our panellists have central government funding. This may be a question for Duncan to answer. Why is it that the heavy lifting in arts funding is public funding Is there a greater role for business and for industry and philanthropy to play in supporting and funding the arts, and particularly business, given that creativity and problem solving are skills that just about every employer tell us they would like our graduates to adapt to? And just about everyone, no matter what sector they're in the room, value creativity. So the question is there a greater role for the business to play in, or broader sector in supporting the creativity?
I don't know the numbers. I don't know how much business already puts into supporting creativity in the arts, actually. You might be surprised. Quite a lot of big companies that I've worked with have got all sorts of artists on their walls. Sorry?
So just raise your mic a little
Oh,
bit.
okay. Oh, I could just project if you want me to. No, I don't know how much business already puts into the arts, as I was just saying. Many boardrooms I've been into have got all sorts of art on the walls, some of which they've commissioned from living artists. So, there's lots of ways that money does flow. I'm not defending them necessarily. I'm just saying, I don't know what the mix really is in terms of funding. But I would say that the thing that's already struck me this morning is what Adrian said. We shouldn't keep talking about funding the arts necessarily, because that sometimes has connotations for certainly hard-nosed businessmen of somebody just sitting in their studio squealing away and producing something they don't understand. Whereas actually, if we started talking about how powerful it is to be creative and how you can express that through different mechanisms, and how it's actually quite useful to make people with their nose to the grindstone at the top of a company actually maybe sit back and think about artistic practice and those kinds of things. If we can stir that into the mix carefully, immediately, if somebody running a business sees that as an advantage, they'll fund it. It's
Look, that's an interesting question, because I came from the ABC, and the concept of asking anyone for money was just foreign to me. And so coming to the library, I came in at a time when we were just launching a $100 million redevelopment of the library. And the day after I accepted the job, my wonderful president let me know that I needed to raise $30 million to complete the project. So I've been on a really steep learning curve over the last 3 years, and I think it's been fascinating. And to both your points, I think that's absolutely right. Because I'm a journalist, I'm a storyteller, and so the first thing I had to understand was, what is the library story, and also to understand the library in the cultural ecosystem. And I think Adrian would know that librarians are terribly humble, beautiful people, and they are focused on public service in the very best sense of the public service ethos. And they are very close to the coalface, and so they know the problems and the issues that they need to solve in their communities, and they just go on and do it. There are so many fantastic initiatives that are just absorbed within local government and library budgets. They don't have the ethos that, and I say this in a good way, that museums and galleries do, to really argue the case and shout from the rooftops around the benefits of their services. And so for us, it was about changing that, taking some of the humility out of the library and saying, hey, look what we do. More than half of all Victorians are members of libraries, and here are governments rolling out a whole lot of policies and practices and initiatives through different modes. When you've got 250 public libraries who are very close to their particular communities. So it was about kind of finding our story. And we had really never been to corporates, or certainly never raised the kind of money that the NGV or the museum might be able to raise. And yet in having those conversations, it wasn't about support us because, this is important and isn't the arts beautiful and it's important for us to have books. It was about really identifying and being able to articulate, and proudly articulate, the economic, educational and cultural and society values that a library actually provides. And in a post-truth world, wow, those benefits are really huge. So it was about getting that story right, and suddenly we found those conversations really easy to have.
I think whenever you try to ask for money, one of the best things about that process, it's not pleasant for any of us actually, but the best thing about it is it makes you think much harder about what you're there for, right?
Yeah.
And then you can state much more clearly what your purpose is, and that makes the institution better, actually, in the long run, in my opinion. Yeah.
You interrogate. You absolutely have to interrogate the veracity of your ask.
I mean, on the humility point, I mean, humility. I said this in university the other day. Humility is a good thing, but you can have too much of a good thing, right? And there's nothing wrong with speaking with confidence and surety about what you are and the service you give to the community and society, and that's, I think, an honest thing to do.
I had this experience very early when I joined the library, and I went to a public library in Altona, and we got there at about 3:00, and you know, it's a shop front and it's a pretty ordinary library, but full of Sudanese community of women who were there. And the librarian was explaining that she and the principal of the secondary school had got together. And the principal of the secondary school was having a really hard time with a whole lot of Year 9 students, boys, who were causing a bit of trouble in the local shopping centre. And so they decided that they would, and a primary school teacher was having trouble because she was sending English language readers home to prep and grade 1 kids who had no one at home who could assist them with reading. So they got together and they piloted with no extra money. They didn't come to the arts, to the Australia Council or anyone else for money, but they just piloted this program to get the Year 9 boys there. All they did was provide afternoon tea to read to the prep and the grade 1 Sudanese kids. And within 2 weeks, that library was also providing English language programs for a group of women. Now, no extra funding. Imagine instituting that from Canberra or even from Spring Street. You never would. And yet the humility element of that. So that was amazing. And when I was sort of amazed, they were like, but, you know, that's kind of what we do. You're new to libraries. This is what we do all the time. The issue with humility in that is that it's not scalable. We're not learning from that. We're not taking that model and you know, looking at how it would be applied elsewhere.
And I think this is a great segue to Adrian. With carriage of the national kind of creative sector, would you like to jump in on this? Yeah.
A couple of things. Just on the business and support, I think there is actually a lot of business support for arts. But if we're moving from, you know, the patronage model through cultural democracy, which we've kind of done, and we're truly embracing this creative industries, and a lot of artists get very nervous about that because the numbers, you know, if you start saying, well, the creative industries contributed $116 billion to GDP and employed over 6% of the workforce nationally, and the current Department Secretary of Communications and the Arts came from infrastructure, and saying, well, this is actually much bigger and it looks like jobs for the future and whatever. Artists get lost in those numbers, quite rightly. You know, so you have to moderate this argument very carefully. But I think the way we think about the way business is related to creativity is still pretty immature in this country. And let me give you one example. In the UK, where they've been talking about this stuff for 20 years, they have something, this is just one example amongst many, the Federation of Creative Industries. It was started by industry. Many of the people who hung around London in the 70s worked out that the great entrepreneurs went to art school, not business school. And all the creative industries, and you can start with arts and the glam sector and museums, but work right through to screen, obviously, to digital industries, possibly gaming, if you're feeling generous, advertising. You know, they realised they couldn't get any of this stuff done without composers, directors, above all storytellers. You know, 80% of films that are made are adaptations of books. So they formed this federation led by a man called Peter Bazalgette, who was a former CEO of ITV, and then became chair of Arts Council England, because he got it. He got this investment arc, if you like. And their mission in life is to persuade government to keep up the public investment in this stuff. So they're very, very profitable industries. And we haven't begun to join the dots like that in this country yet. It's still, you know, where I think industry has actually moved, and all those definitions between what creativity is and isn't is starting to mercifully melt away. we haven't organised around that as an industry yet.
Peter Bazalgette, incidentally, was a close relative, grandson or something, of the bloke that built the main cross sewer in London to intercept all the sewage going to the River Thames in the Victorian era. So there you go. That's a creative act of engineering.
I think one of the opportunities for those of us working in the creative sector is to sing with one voice. We tend to have our own piece and not quite join up in the way, and the analogies often are the agricultural sector or the sports sector have potentially been a little bit better at joining forces and advocating as one. Would you agree with that, Adrian in particular, or Kate? Or do you think we are mobilising?
Well, I'd like to think we're starting to. I was talking to a professional lobbyist the other day, a woman who's really very successful. She hasn't worked in the arts, but she's worked a bit in education and other things. And she said to me, the arts sector is brilliant at mobilising and hopeless at organising. They're the two ways you tend to advocate to government. You either mobilise, and there are times where you need to, but really sophisticated organising, like what messages delivered where, particularly for an election cycle, all that stuff. The time-honoured path in the arts in this country is to say, I want what they've got. It's not fair that they've got it. Bring it over here. And it's too easy to just drive wedges between. So yes, in the broad, I agree.
You're all landing very, very big strategies. So, Adrian, you've just launched the Australia Council's new strategy. Duncan, you're working on the university's 2030. Kate, you've got one of the most significant building infrastructure projects and strategy associated with it. And Duncan, you're in the university strategy, you've had to deal with some really, really significant issues and ensure the university thrives through global movements, through the economy, through the role of in our region of China. Does creativity get a look in that kind of an environment?
Again, you could argue that the whole strategy is just a tissue of creativity, as it were. But it's building the strategy for the university. Universities are very large, complex, and consultative organisms. And building a strategy for the university requires a great deal of work. And Julie in the audience here has done all of the work, hard work actually. But the business of consultation with people and then synthesising all of that information and then coming up with modifying. You've already had a creative process to think about the ideas of where you want to lead the place, but then to listen to that consultation and to modify your ideas and to come up with maybe new thinking around it. And then the act of writing it, you wind up with a 6-page document for a year's work. And so, but you've got to distill into that 6 pages all of the key things that you want to say. And that's a very interesting piece of creative writing, I can tell you. And then you put it to your university executive committee and they want to tear it apart. And then you put it to your council and they want to tear it apart in a different direction. So again, you've got to do all the creative writing to weave through all of that process. Yeah. So just the act of doing it is creative. But then the beautiful thing is out of that comes creative ideas. So our cultural commons sort of idea has been, and Adrian sort of started thinking about this just before he deserted us. But it was great working with Adrian in the early stages of thinking about this. And then over the last year or so, as you know, we've worked on it, Julie's worked on it and others. Sue at the back of the audience there. I think this cultural commons idea is a really good one. I think it's going to be really great to get $350 million worth of collections and our performing arts and get it out there and work with the city in inventive and creative ways. Work nationally and maybe even supranationally, to get our fantastic art out there, but not just in staid and boring exhibitions, but in really creative ways. I think that's fantastic.
And so for the Cultural Commons is an organising framework for the University of Melbourne to start to think about what we used to call our cultural estate, our museums, our galleries, our collections. As Duncan said, $350 million value on our collection. We've got 15 museums and galleries, and we now mobilising them into a way where we share. We think of it as a commons instead of an estate, and to really play our part in the city as a very strong cultural player. Adrian, your strategy, creativity connects us. Why connectivity? Where did that come from, and what are you hoping to achieve through the strategy?
there are three big shifts, I think, in the way we framed it. One is we've moved from arts, and you don't have to be absolute about these things, but it's a direction of travel. And I think one of the fundamental purposes of strategy is to just make you plausible with your stakeholders and have something to hook your actions to, when you're being pulled in various directions. But certainly the move from arts to creativity, to see this as investment in something much larger with broad social impact. And I think we've embraced a public value agenda very strongly. And by that we mean economic values, social and cultural value. We take a simple view that this is public investment. It has, with some rigour, to make a public return. You have quite a sophisticated view of that, I think. So we've talked about the creative industries. If you talk about, what Nesta are predicting about the future of work in 20 years' time, those AI-resistant jobs that are actually going to propel the economy. If you talk about cultural tourism to this country, 2 years ago we had 8.2 million tourists, 46% said they were here for cultural experiences. 1 million of them went bush into the regions and are building these microeconomies there, which is allowing First Nations artists to stay on country and do their work. So all that stuff. Kate's already touched on the social benefits. So everything, and there are many people at the university working on this stuff. The effect of arts and creativity on ageing, on mental health. I spend as much time talking to ministers of health, foreign affairs, trade, as I do to my own minister. And the cultural one, I think, is the big contemporary issue for this country. We have become the most diverse, collection of the most diverse cultures on earth. And if artists don't have something beneficial to say, and that can go one of two ways. We can either embrace the enormous potential of this, but there are plenty of examples of what happens when public policy goes wrong in this area. Now, if arts and culture doesn't have something to say about cultural exchange and understanding, who on earth does? So they're the kinds of contemporary issues we're trying to embrace.
Okay, go for it.
And I think to add to that too, I think the role that we can play in encouraging public discourse at this point in time and at this moment in time, and I think we were speaking before about the diversity that you see in that library now. I think if you think about how we have organised as communities, it's harder and harder to find places and spaces where everyone is genuinely welcome and no transaction is required. And then if you think about the way we are organising ourselves online, we are more and more gravitating to our own echo chambers. And so I think the extension of that too is the role that we have to play to ensure that robust civil public discourse continues. And I think that's a real key. I think all of those public benefits are important, but I think that one is a key one at this point in time.
And I think, if you thought about a group of people in the room more able to shape the future of thinking, a university, one of the most loved and visited public libraries and a broadcaster at the head of it, and our National Arts funding organisation, we do have an extraordinary opportunity to shape future thinking. What kind of responsibility is that for each of you? Do you see it that way, or do you just get on with your job and hope that an outcome lands where it should, or do we really take this shaping of future generations really in a different direction? Do you think about it in your average day?
Yeah, look, I actually do. I mean, I think two things. I think when I got a job at the ABC, I remember walking in the doors at Ripon Lee and feeling this sense of, God, I'm part of this incredible national broadcaster legacy. And I felt that every day at the ABC. And I think most of my colleagues felt that every day at the ABC. This sense that you needed to uphold a really important service that had a long legacy. And I absolutely feel the same way about the State Library. And I think at a moment in time when we are doing a once-in-a-generation physical redevelopment, but more importantly, that really gnarly conversation about what is a 21st century library and how do we ensure that we're catering to the very, very different needs of our users. I had a meeting very early on when we were doing this redevelopment with the State Library Users Group, an incredible group of very passionate library supporters, very much focused on research and academia. And they were very concerned about the number of young people in the library who were perhaps not accessing the collection. And that's a reasonable conversation to have. And then I came out and someone had sent me a YouTube video of, I didn't know at the time, but they were two incredibly famous skateboarders, and they were skating on the front of the State Library steps, and one of our security guards, and they were amazing, and one of our security guards kind of shooed them off. And one of them said, well, that's really unfair because, we've got State Library tattoos. And they rolled up their sleeves. One had a tat on his arm and one had a tat on his leg. And so at the next State Library Users Group, I said, look, I know you love the library, but they're inked. So,
Wow.
And actually, I kind of think that's the beauty of the State Library. For everyone, it means something different. And, we kind of have to remember that as you shape the future.
Wow. I don't know, for those of you who know the Chowchak Wing building at UTS in Sydney, the brickies on that project have the brick formation tattooed on their arms. Yeah, it's a Gary building. To the question of responsibility. Yeah.
So obviously, a university is absolutely central in this kind of argument, right? We are educating the youth, current youth, leaders of the future, if you want to put it in those terms. I'm extremely allergic and disappointed by the language of job-ready graduates. I'd like somebody to try to define what that means in the modern age, even actually. It's extremely simplistic and somewhat backward-looking, in my opinion. What we are absolutely having to do and should be doing in universities is helping to make the intellectual formation of our young people, helping to teach them how to think. I don't want to teach them what to think at all. And I think we should encourage diversity of view. But as long as that diversity of view is based on a really rigorous thinking process where people understand how to think and how to work out what is valid and what isn't, and how to interrogate facts and knowledge to see what is just hot air and what is actually has a chance at least of being right. These are the things that we in the universities really should be doing. And I think that the level of thinking that's displayed in public life at the moment is very poor. And I'm not having a go at anybody here. I just think that the way that public life has developed, it means that people come out with sound bites, they come out with Twitter comments and etc. Never have to formulate an argument for a premise, test that argument, and get it out there in an intellectually sound way. And this is, in my opinion, one of the many reasons why politics is degenerating at the moment. There is no real hardcore thinking on display. Now, I know some of these politicians, they're not stupid, they can think, but the system drives them at the moment into that kind of display. So it really is the triumph of style over substance. And that's exactly the wrong way around for me, personally. So we have to think very hard indeed about how we navigate our way through the current sort of choppy waters, whilst still holding close to our hearts the idea that we are helping with the intellectual formation of our young people. I'm not interested actually in the knowledge download. They'll get that from the internet anyway. What we need to be doing, for example, is making sure we help our students to understand what are the trusted sources, if you like, on the internet. I'm not talking about just pushing them into one political view or one view on a particular subject. I'd like to give them the wide range of different views from the valid commentators and from the people who are the intellectually valid people in those different spheres, and then give them the tools to interrogate that and to actually then help form their own intellect such that when they go out into public life and become leaders of the future, they at least know how to do it, even if they choose not to.
Adrian, do you want to comment on that?
Well, only to say it's probably the motivation.
Yeah.
The reason I decided to have a crack at this job was actually the 6 years I'd spent back at the University of Melbourne. It wasn't the 30 years I'd spent working in the arts sector in publishing or performing arts. It was actually the kind of thinking that was going on at the university where, particularly amongst my close colleagues, we were thinking all the time about how to articulate the impact of the university, which so largely stands behind so many of the organisations that have the impact. And the Australia Council, in a microcosm way, is a bit like that. You know, you're making investments in organisations and artists that have major impact, but how you articulate that to drive further investment and appreciation of what they're doing is still a very similar challenge. I think Nugget Coombs, who was the first. So this, interestingly, and this goes to Duncan's point about the failure of a political language, the Australia Council was born at a moment in time in the 60s and early 70s, and it was really Gorton, Holt, Whitlam, you know, because there was this bipartisan view that Australia's cultural identity was arriving at the speed of sound. And Nugget Coombs, you know, West Australian boy from the bush, first governor of the Reserve Bank, also the first chair of the Australia Council, used to talk about the council as a civic, fundamentally a civic organisation, and it was the artists who expressed our national identity at a time that looked complex. 60 years on, it's far more complex given the layers of culture here, but I think the fundamental purpose is kind of the same. Those are the responsibilities you carry.
Yeah, I think that notion of the civic institution is really, really important, and to each of you, you know, fundamental to what we do. I'm conscious of time, and I would be happy to talk all day, but I just and hear from these guys all day. But is there a question? Do we have some questions from the audience? Yeah, we've got a number. All right, just put your hands up if you have a question. Yeah, and okay, so I'm going to just go to the woman in the front. Thanks. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Rabine from Ahoy Hoy. Is this very loud? It's very loud. Hi. So entrepreneur / artist / business person / community that we live in. As leaders of your organisations, how do you foster an environment for creativity for your own people? What steps do you take to make sure that happens?
Yeah, and Duncan and I were speaking about this before. I think engagement, and I think a library is somewhere it's quite hierarchical, and also I think historically and sector wide often attracts introverts, and so and I've come from media, which does not attract introverts. So we did go through a process, which was a year-long process of really just posing that question: what is the 21st century state library? What does that look like? And that was a process where we really invested a lot of time ensuring that staff left the job that they were doing to answer that question, and that every staff member was involved in that engagement. And that was sort of twofold, because the best ideas come from the team, but also to change the way we work to ensure that hierarchy was broken down, and that part of it was around active problem solving every day, and raising problems and looking for solutions together. So it was twofold. It was the vision piece, but it was also really to say, well, how do we want to work together? And if we know that, in fact, our library is going to have to continue to evolve, and, you know, we're all in constant change, how do we use the vision piece to start a different conversation? And that in itself, as Duncan said, was a really creative process. You know, sometimes you might not have defined that in the conversations we're in, but it was. And it was critical thinking, which you know, the team was fantastic at, but probably didn't apply in the way that we wanted them to on a daily basis. And it's really shifted things.
Oh, I'll speak up. I'm in Blair. I'm in agriculture. The question I've got is, and Adrian mentioned about science and then didn't mention it again. Insects like colour, fish like colour, birds like colour. Tim Flannery's book on the bird of paradise, 6. Emphasised colour. Have we done any research on finding where the genetic creativity gene is. We have migrated from Africa to Australia. We like to live on the sea. We did a lot of migration along the seaside. We love trees. So I just wonder, wouldn't it be a good thing to find out the gene for creativity, and then we can go to the government and say, you've got to fund it. Just like we fund sex and we fund alcohol, we should find the genetic one. Thanks.
So I'm a... I actually... I've spent my entire career in genetics and genomics, and I can tell you for an absolute definite fact there is not a single gene for creativity. If you want to talk about the sciences for a millisecond, there will be a massive number of different genes with different allelic forms and different mutations in them that will all add up to this emergent property that we call creativity. I think it's hard to even think about how you would chase down a gene for creativity when we don't even understand how consciousness works. And I think creativity is the emergent property of how the brain works. That is consciousness is also tied up with the emergent property that is creativity. So I think it's a non-starter at the moment, anyway, in terms of doing that. But I think I'll probably leave it at that. Actually.
Jeff Robinson from Oricon. As an engineer working in sustainability, I see the real benefits of creativity in the people that I work with, and our company really seeks out folk that have both left and right brain thinking. I'm interested in your thoughts, Professor Maskell, on how well you reckon the uni is doing at the moment to encourage scientists, doctors, engineers, those in the STEM professions, to embrace the arts and creative thinking. I know there's lots of programs that are there, but actually getting people as part of courses and what they're learning to actually go and say, you will benefit as an engineer or an architect or a scientist from going to these things. Do you think it's going really, really well, or do you think it could be better?
I don't know how it's going, actually, because so even though I've been here for a year and 2 months now in this job, I haven't got around to every single department and school in the university, and I don't know how people are thinking about this sort of subject. When I do go around to see people in their departments and schools, we talk about more sort of mundane, one might also almost say tedious university business.
Good question to ask them.
Yeah, and I mean, again, in a university, certainly the kind of university that our university is, you don't go around telling people what to do. What you do is you give them opportunities. So I think we are increasingly giving people opportunities to do this stuff at this interface. I mean, Rosie's Science Gallery, for example, is a classic example of how we're trying to build some of these links, if you like. Whenever I speak, if I have the opportunity, if it's the right subject matter, I always talk about how I think the arts are important and how science and arts should be working together rather than in any form of divide. So that's almost all I can do, actually, is to provide the right environment and then give a message out on a regular basis about these things. So I don't know is the answer whether we get that right or not. But I do know that quite a lot of the people I know who are who are in the scientific area do interface a lot with our artistic colleagues. I see them often at concerts down at Hamer Hall, and whenever we do something at the conservatorium, a lot of the science people turn up. So I think it's quite a healthy exchange going on. But you can always get better as well. So that's the other driving force for me. Continually strive to be even better at it. So, yeah.
Thanks. And look, I think we'll have one very, very quick last one, and then we'll let everyone.
Just in response to that question, Susan Aldridge from the Conservatorium, Heather Gaunt from the Percy Granger Museum, can you tell us what you were doing last night and who you were doing it with?
Thank you, Susan. Last night and 2 nights a week for the last 3 weeks, I've been super privileged, along with a group of about 50 general staff from across the university, to play in the University All-Staff Orchestra, organised through Ignite Lab, which Susan runs. So the program was organised by students of the faculty. There was about 5 students on the team. They put out a call a couple of months ago for general staff on the staff email to say who'd like to come play in the orchestra. And I was like, oh, this is fantastic. And many people in the group have not played their instruments for decades, probably. So the first rehearsal was somewhat shoddy. And now we're sounding very good. And the whole point of it, though, is engagement across disciplines, using the arts and creativity and collaboration, sharing, non-hierarchical, joyful, wonderful.
So look, I'll bring the session to a close. Thanks so much for joining us for this conversation. We'll be back again next year with a continuation of this forum, so stay tuned for our first topic of next year. Could you please join me in thanking what has been a fabulous conversation from some of our best civic leaders in the nation. Thank you.